Funding for Current Conversations is provided by University of Oklahoma President's Office, University of Oklahoma Outreach, and World Literature Today. Welcome to Current Conversations. I'm R.C. Davis-Undiano, and today we're going to be discussing the explosive issue of racism on college and university campuses across the U.S. Race on campus is one of the most pressing issues of our time, and it is becoming a huge part of the important national conversation about race in America. To talk to us about these important issues, we have with us today the Associate Vice President of Outreach at the University of Oklahoma, Dr. Belinda Biscoe, and the Executive Director of the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma, Dr. Kathleen Wong. Could we start out by hearing from both of you briefly about the journey in your life that has led you to this point where you're focused on racism, race on campus issues that deal with racism in higher education?
Great. What a wonderful question, R.C. For me, despite my youthful appearance, I grew up in the Deep South in Atlanta in the days of segregation and Jim Crow laws. And so some of these issues are very near and dear to my heart. I had both the opportunity and the misfortune in some ways of being the first African American to be involved in a number of things as a young teenager in Atlanta. For example, I was homecoming queen at my all-segregated high school when I was a senior, and that year the state of Georgia decided to have an interracial football game, and it was the first football game in the history of any high schools, a black high school, to play a white high school in football. Naturally, the football is historic. That event was at the white high school, and when my group arrived, when my high school classmates and I arrived to the white high school, there was literally a police officer on every bleacher, every end of each bleacher with a cocked rifle. Wow. I mean, it was probably the most quiet football game I've ever been to.
Oh my gosh.
No student, whether you were black or white, made one noise. I also had the opportunity to be with the first cohort of teens who were selected as teen models in Atlanta, because prior to that time, no African American young female had been selected by the department stores to model, because what people said was there are no African American girls beautiful enough to be models for our department stores. And so I had to deal with a lot of what we call micro or subtle aggressions where white girls would say things. I remember one night working with another young white teen whose uncle was the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in Atlanta, in Georgia. And she said to me after we became friends, she said, "Belinda, you know, I realize now after getting to know you that nothing my uncle has told me growing up about blacks is true. You're nothing like what he told me black people were like." So I think at a very young age, I worked in the inner city registering African Americans to vote, often signing X's for people who were illiterate and could not read or write. So I think at a very young age, I committed myself without maybe doing it in a conscious way to deal with some of the social injustices. And I think at a very young age, I also decided that despite the inequities that were imposed upon me, not being able to have access to so many things in the culture, that I could find ways to make a difference that didn't reinforce the negative, oppressive ways I was exposed to in the South.
Powerful journey. Kathy?
Yeah, my journey is I would say I sort of had an accidental career and path to where I am today. And part of it is that I came late to academia. So about 22 years ago, I was a union butcher in Oakland, not thinking of an academic career.
You said union butcher.
A union butcher, local
Okay.
120. But I had spent my spare time and my off time doing community work, working, and I was employed for a while as well with a community trio program, working with Southeast Asian refugees as a bilingual counselor. So working in Chinatown in San Francisco, working with the Mayor's Youth Program in San Francisco, and doing those kind of things. So I came to academia very late and fortunately was mentored when I was in the California State University system. And was told that I should go to, take the GRE. And I always tell this joke, take the GRE. And I was like, in the Bay Area, I was like, is that a bus? Where am I taking it to? But I was heavily mentored because some of my professors saw, that I had some promise and that I was very passionate about issues of social justice, but also, issues of intercultural communication in particular. So I kind of stumbled into it as a way to leave my career in being a butcher and getting a degree so that I could now work in community organizations. And then ended up in graduate school and had a career as faculty, and now here I am. So it's more of a indirect path.
You both had amazing journeys.
Yeah.
Racism, how can we define it? People talk about it all the time, and I think we all feel that we know racist behavior when we see it. What is racism?
Sometimes there's a debate. Some people just simply say that racism is poor treatment of people because of their identity, what group they represent because of basically their race. There are other people who feel that unless violence is associated with that behavior, that it doesn't elevate to the level of racism, but more biases and prejudice. I think in the literature you find it defined either way, where violence is associated with it, and then where it's simply the association of prejudices against a group because of their...
Does it help to bring in the idea of levels? I mean, does that help here? I mean, like individual racism, institutional racism, is that helpful or?
I mean, I think it's helpful to frame it at those different levels, but at the same time, I think it's also helpful to think about how everyday people think about. So the backdrop is everyday people, and not in an elitist way, but most of us in the media, in conversations with our family, with our friends and relatives, and even in our classrooms, there's a way that people think about racism in the ways that Belinda has described. And there's a different way that we in academia try to frame it. So yes, there's individual action, there is sort of institutional, societal, and one of the things I think that I like to make the distinction about is that there's a social psychology behind it, and we need to talk about what people focus about a lot is intent. Did I intend to harm somebody? And I think when you're talking about racism, sometimes the most well-meaning people can do things that have a racist impact and not really realize it.
Does it have to do with people projecting their own fears onto somebody else that's different from them, where it's really their own fears they've personified in somebody else? Is that part of it?
I think it is often about people's other fears, but I think it's also, to go back to your other question, kind of endemic and systemic to our society. So when you talk about structural racism, you're really talking about that interaction between policy and institutions and practices. And these things sometimes are so ingrained. I'll give you an example, and this is a common example. A group of city planners decide to put low-income housing in a neighborhood for Latinos or Blacks. They locate it in an area where the tax base is low, there's no easy access to shopping or other resources. And so while it may not be readily apparent that that is racism, it is, because the policies and practices of locating that low-income housing in places where people are not given the opportunity to have access, good schooling.
I'd like to add to that picture, because I think, in fact, this happens a lot. Add to what you said, that industrial wastes are often stored very near the kind of neighborhood where people are being hurt, PCBs.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, it can be terrible. So it's environmental pollution.
Exactly.
Is part of being poor.
And part of that is people in the dominant culture are willing to protest so that the local substance abuse agency is not in their neighborhood. And poor and low income and people of color who may also be poor often are just not educated about a lot of these issues.
So I think the way that structures, and especially if you think of structures that are recreated through our belief systems and practices and our lack of awareness. So I'll have an example of, for example, housing on campus, right? So we're talking about higher ed context. Often we think of practices being sort of mundane, and so we don't think that there is a possibility that we might be denying opportunity or equity to other people. So in housing, typically there is like a deadline for a deposit at a certain time and a certain date. And at many universities, people will fill the halls according to when they're ready and when they can roll them over. And what happens is the people who can afford to apply to make that first deadline often end up being people who have resources, right? They're not the students who are solely on financial aid. They're not the students who have a hard time coming up with that deposit. And so what happens is you end up segregating people.
So there's no one person that's willingness to be bad and for people to be treated badly and unfairly, but it's built into the way things are set up. So that would be structural racism.
Right, as well as a lack of multicultural literacy about other people's lives. So if you yourself, such as I grew up working class and very poor, you understand that, gosh, some people may not be able to make that first deadline. Is there an impact? Are we self-selecting people through this deposit system? If you're at the table, you might say that, you know, and the answer might be no. We can look at historically, there hasn't been that problem.
There's so much about race issues in the news right now. Could you both maybe cite something that you've learned about recently that's a little discouraging about the issue of race, and then maybe something that's encouraging, something you're glad to see?
But one of the things that I find troubling are some of the dialogues or lack of dialogue, and I know that you've talked about this too, Belinda, about the Trayvon Martin case, about the Michael Brown case, about the lack of indictments in New York and in Ferguson. And I think that people are expressing themselves, but it's kind of like serial expression, right? So I say my piece, you say your piece, you say your piece, and never the twain shall meet in terms of actually having a discussion. I think you can have discussion and have conflict, and very emotional and high conflict, but it should be engaging, and there should be a level of commitment to our society as a whole to talk about those things, not to suppress each other, but to actually engage. And so I find that, you know, that kind of discouraging. At the same time, I know that there are people who are doing some incredible programming and who are facilitating discussions and dialogues on campuses that are thoughtful and structured and do allow people to bring their opinions and ideas and, you know, expression of injustice, of inequity, or of their own life experiences.
I wonder if people go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I just wanted to build on what Kathy said because I think she's made some really good points. I think one of the issues, and I don't know that it elevates to, oh my goodness, on campuses is kind of what's been happening with some of the parties that fraternities and other groups are having, where students are wearing costumes. I think one recently was a Halloween party somewhere where students were in costumes that were very offensive to Latino students, and, you know, black faces and all kinds of mockery, which we sometimes refer to as microaggressions. I'm not sure these students were intending purposely to offend other groups. They thought it was cute or fun or whatever, but it's sometimes those microaggressions that continue to do a lot of psychic harm. I've been noticing in the news recently that there are some university presidents who are taking the lead in bringing students, faculty, staff together on campuses to really peel back the onion and open up the dialogue and conversation. One of the things I think we both notice as women of color and minority women is that sometimes the dominant culture is very uncomfortable in this country talking about these issues. And I think everybody walks around on eggshells out of fear. Will I be perceived as racist? Will I be perceived as having issues? So rather than open up the conversation, I'm going to keep my mouth shut and not make any mistakes and have people see me in a light that I really don't intend to be viewed. So I think we have got to start talking about it. I told Kathy, I think one of the things that Desmond Tutu did really well in South Africa after the downfall of apartheid was to have the reconciliation councils. We've really never reconciled anything in this country openly.
They could have gone one of two ways. They could have gone for revenge, or they could go for getting information and healing.
And I think we still are bleeding and not healing. So we have spurts of things happening and then nothing happens. Then we have a tragedy happen and there's spurts, but we don't have any long-term systemic ways to deal with our systems and these issues.
It seems like there's almost always too much that's unspoken. I heard a show on NPR about Ferguson in Missouri, and in-depth research now is showing there's just a terrible set of relationships between the police and poor people in general. What happened there that was in the news is the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more to it. And so often there's just an over-focus on the flashpoint and not the real social causes of these things.
So last night I just finished one of the intergroup dialogue trainings that we have started with our center. And we have a group of 10 folks that I'm training in intergroup dialogues, and 2 of them are Norman police officers with some campus community folks as well, so faculty, staff, and other people. And what's really interesting is, coming out of last night, someone said, and I won't divulge who said, one of the folks said of the group, I don't even talk about these issues of race and homophobia with my own wife or with my own family. It's somewhat freeing to be able to talk about it, to ask questions, to make mistakes, to get the research on it as well as the feeling of, what my opinion is, in a way that I can also hear how other people who are really different than me, I can understand what they're thinking as well, and that reduces a lot of that sort of personal anger through lack of understanding, right? So you might still have your opinion and still disagree with that other person, but you understand what the disagreement is about. It's not just about, the way that you said something to me. It's about content, and it's about life experience. And so I think that we're not having that kind of dialogue because it's scary to do it.
So far, we're really talking about race in the culture in a kind of a general way. The Supreme Court cases, going back to Brown versus the Board of Education, and before that with Ada Lois Sipuel from Oklahoma, 1948, in front of the Supreme Court. What part of have these Supreme Court decisions played in how we see race in America? They focus the issues on education, for sure.
Sure. As a person kind of directly and indirectly impacted, for example, by Brown versus the Board of Education, which I think was in 1957. Of course, in Georgia, which is where I'm from, desegregation actually didn't even begin until probably the 70s. So the schools were segregated there for a long, long time. I think one of the challenges for me as someone who has a foot in both common education and higher education is that we tend to look for the school system to be the panacea or the cure for all of the ills in society. When I look back on some of that now, I think it was really good that, one, the Supreme Court barred separate but equal, because having grown up in segregated schools, I know that they were not equal.
That was Brown versus the Board of Education.
Yeah. But what's happened is our inner cities have now become black, brown, and bankrupt, as I like to put it. The school system is resegregated, not because, just because the systems are heavily populated with poor white kids and students of color. Now looking back, I think the real issue that should have been tackled was housing, because if neighborhoods are fairly socioeconomically diverse, racially and ethnically diverse and kids are going to a neighborhood school, you have natural integration and diversity across race, across socioeconomic groups. So the issues are complex. I think the court cases unravel and reveal the case in Texas, for example, issues that we need to address. And I'll let Kathy speak on this because I can go on and on about the court
So I'd like to
cases.
talk about the Gratz and Grutter Supreme Court cases that came down in 2003 about affirmative action.
There were two cases that
There were
right?
two cases, right? One was for the law school and one was for the undergraduate admissions. And I think that, people kind of focus on, did they win? Did we win? Did we lose? And I'd like to focus on the amicus briefs and some of the research that persuaded, for example, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor to rule in favor or to write a favorable opinion of affirmative action in sort of a tailored sort of way. And one of the things that she found really compelling was the enormous amount of research that showed that universities benefit from having a critical mass of people who are different, not just a few, not just a token, but under conditions of critical mass, everybody benefits. However, you also have to have structured interaction. And so it goes back to this sort of having the way to make space, to have people learn how to talk about really difficult issues, that it has to be meaningful contact, not just sort of living in the dorms together, and it has to be a critical mass. And I think that for me, that the testimony on the research on that was really powerful, as well as the multiple amicus briefs from the large, all the motor companies, all the car companies, the military, all saying that this is what we want universities to do, is to have students, white and students of color, have the ability to work with people who are different in meaningful ways, and that's what.
So I guess yeah, go ahead.
No, and so I was going to say, so Kathy's point is so powerful. I remember when one of my daughters went to college. I won't say the college, but one of the things they did, it was this purposeful kind of bringing students together. They had a big orientation, but part of that included dealing with diversity issues. So I don't know if any of you have ever participated in this little activity called taking a cultural walk. We have a horde of people in the part of a room, and it says, everybody who loves rock music, walk to the other side of the room. And what you begin to see are all the ways you are like people who may not look like you. So one of the things they said when my daughter participated in this in her freshman year was, all the students who feel like you grew up with privilege walk to the other side of the room. Well, I'm a psychologist. My husband at the time was an eye surgeon, an ophthalmologist. Yes, my daughter grew up with lots of resources and privilege. So although she was Black, she walked to the other side of the room. When they debriefed this, one of the white girls in her freshman class, rural Indiana, said, I was shocked to see Brandy walk to the other side of the room. She's Black. How could she grow up with privilege? And it was such an opportunity, going back to what Kathy is saying, for the facilitator. My daughter is sharing this experience with me to help students understand diversity in all of its different colors in terms of socioeconomically. This rural student from Indiana assumed because my daughter was Black that she'd grown up in the hood, in the inner city ghetto, and that she was poor, and there was no way she could have been.
Back to that basic scenario of somebody you don't know very well and projecting something on them that may not belong to them, has nothing to do with them at all. People watching this, I think, are going to ask themselves the question, what can I do in my life? What can I do in my job place? How can I make a difference as an individual? What would you say to somebody who asked that question?
My answer would probably be this. I think one of the problems, and it probably isn't going to deal directly with your question, but indirectly, is that we focus too much on hit and miss approaches to dealing with this problem. I think we've got to be honest as a country about looking at all the systems and coming up with multiple strategies across the systems. What should the public school system be doing at a very young age to bring kids together to accept and embrace each other, to collaborate, to work together across race, gender, sexual orientation, whatever the differences that may divide us. What's the role of higher education, and how do we purposely do things? Families. I am convinced that families need to do more. When I see things projected out there by young people sometimes, I often believe that there have been these very negative conversations in families. The parents or guardians wouldn't act out on this, but then their children have internalized this and they act out on it, and the parents
They don't know any better.
They go, oh my goodness, my child committed this horrible. But children are very malleable, they're learning, they're taking in all of these things.
I would like to say that I think it's important for people to understand that they need to actually take action. I think in academia we spend a lot of time thinking about things, and we use a lot of we bank a lot on our goodwill and good intentions and being nice. And so it's not enough to be nice. It's not enough to be well intended. You know, there's tons of research, compelling research on the best ways to set up classrooms, to do our work, to do committee work, to get feedback in systematic ways so that we can have multiple perspectives. You don't have to have everyone at the table, right?
Mercy, if I
but
could,
you can learn.
Yeah.
just one thing, and I would say action to me is so important, but action does not have to be violent. And I think it's so important to say that. I think when I saw a lot of what happened on television, and I know that's more, a piece of it, my hope is that people are going to step back and say, how do we bring diverse groups? Kathy is one of the best experts in this country on intergroup dialogue. How do we bring groups that may not see eye to eye together to come up with actions and solutions that we all have an investment in?
On that note, we are out of time. I'm so sorry. We'll have to do this again. I want you to come back. Thank you
We
so
want
much.
to come
Thank
back.
you for being here.
Thank you, Rich.
And I'm so glad that you could be with us today. Please join us next time for Current Conversation. Thank you for watching.